Hello? Can people see me or hear me? Good evening. Tonight will be closed caption, and our interpreter, Carmen Sanders, is from the Chicago Hearing Society. Thank you. Also, thank you to Alternative Communication Services for closed captioning tonight. My name is W. Robert Schultz III, and I use the pronouns he and him, and I'm on staff at Active Trans. Tonight, I am here along with my colleagues, Julia Garisminko, who is running the tech tonight, and tonight's moderator, Linda Lopez. Next slide, Julia. Julia will be monitoring the chat for any issues and for any questions you may have for our panelists. We will use questions posted to the chat during the Q&A portion later in the program. Also, thank you to those who submitted questions ahead of time. I am here to welcome you to the Active Transit Alliance, or as we say, Active Trans Second Town Hall Transit Justice Talk, COVID-19 and Beyond. Tonight's discussion is advancing walking and biking projects during COVID-19. Active Trans is a membership organization. Our mission is to advocate for walking, biking, and public transportation to create healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities. Active Trans is 20,000 members strong. If you're not a member, consider joining Active Trans. Also, Active Trans works around the Chicago region, including the suburbs. Our first Active Trans talk focused on public transit, especially CTA buses. Tonight, we will focus on another two important mobility modalities: walking and biking. At this point, the English language hasn't come up with an all-inclusive term. However, tonight, when I use the words walking or pedestrians, I want to emphasize I am including our brothers, sisters, and siblings who use mobility aids like wheelchairs and scooters to get around Chicago. Also, as we interrogate how the public byways are used and how to make them better for all users, we must remember those who have visual impairments also. When we say transportation is a human right, that means everyone. We hope tonight that we especially consider the needs of people who walk and roll and get around and need that the infrastructure to do so. And tonight, we want to especially focus on pedestrian issues. We talk about bike lanes quite a bit. We will touch upon that, but we want to especially highlight walking tonight if we can. As a quick aside, Active Trans is currently in the midst of a virtual activity. We're having a walking challenge. You can find more information online and sign up and monitor the walking that you do throughout your neighborhood as you conduct your daily activities and go to and fro. That information is available on the Active Trans website. Also, I'd like to note that on Monday, November the 16th, is the World Day of Remembrance for victims of traffic violence. For more info, head to the AARP Facebook page to watch the virtual observance at noon on Monday the 16th. I have a couple other things I want to quickly lay out and acknowledge. I want to thank the elected officials we invited tonight, That was State Representative Teresa Ma and 40th Ward Alderman Andre Vasquez. Unfortunately, I've had a conversation with Representative Ma, and if you follow Twitter, you know that she recently tested positive for the COVID virus, and she is taking care of her health. So we wish her the best this evening. We wish we had her along, but maintaining your health is of prime importance. But we're very glad that Alderman Andre Vasquez is joining us for the evening. We selected those two elected officials because both of them are passionate advocates for multimodal mobility in their communities while keeping an eye on justice issues. If Representative Ma was here, and she continues to represent the 2nd District of Illinois. It's on the south side, and it's a district generally centered around the greater Chinatown community. And Alderman Vasquez represents the 40th Ward on the north side. We paired these elected officials, and we'll talk about these two communities because there are groundbreaking pedestrian and bike developments that are in process in both areas, and there's challenges too. In addition, Active Trans has worked with community groups in those areas. So I would also like to thank tonight 2 community representatives. Next slide, please, Julia. Darek Lau from the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, and Renee Patten. She's a co-chair of the Edgewater Community Sustainability Project. Active Trans cannot be effective without strong community partners, and we're glad to have their representatives here tonight. Darek is a staff person at the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community. He's a program assistant. Renee is a co-chair of the volunteer Edgewater group. I think I'm ready for our next slide. During COVID, Active Trans is responding in 3 ways. 1, follow the lead of public health professionals. 2, prioritize the essential trips and mobility of essential workers and people going about doing essential trips. And 3, prioritize racial equity. Now, a couple of housekeeping items. This should be familiar to people who have been on a Zoom meeting or 2. We're meeting everyone except the speakers. If you notice you're not muted, please mute yourself. That'll cut down on unwanted noise. Only the panelists' videos will be available, shown to the participants. Your attendees should turn off your videos. It helps the bandwidth. Also, if you want to adjust the size of the PowerPoint slides, but we're almost done with them, you can use the vertical bar in your gallery. So right now, I'd like to introduce the communities that we're focusing on tonight. But keep in mind the issues that we're discussing that are relevant to these communities, that are relevant to Chicago throughout. This slide is an overarching issue that's very important, and it impacts both the communities. We'll be talking about Chinatown as well as Uptown and throughout Chicago. You know, speed kills, and in the ideal world, we'd like to see a universal Chicagoland speed limit lower than 30 miles. And there's many ways to achieve that. And when pedestrian crashes happen with automobiles, there's a greater survival rate the slower the automobile is traveling, as shown with the little chart on the left-hand side. And plus, when the driver is moving slower, their field of vision widens. There's a lot of barriers and obstacles to obtaining this vision, but this is a long-term goal of active trans and people that are concerned about increasing pedestrian safety and achieving the goals of the Vision Zero plan the city has adopted. So keep that in mind as we continue on this evening. So the next slide is of Chinatown. Um, the community came together and a couple years ago did a walkability report. They went, through all the streets and made evaluation for the condition of the sidewalks, safety crossings for pedestrians, bicycle networks. On the right-hand side, you see a little map of the study area, the walkability report. The next slide is a slide just so people can place central part of Chinatown in the context with the larger South Side community and greater Chinatown. There's a map there. You see where some of the CTA rail lines are, and you see Archer Street, which is the diagonal. And Chinatown, greater Chinatown, has some of the same issues many other parts of Chicago have, where we have diagonals like Ogden and Clark and Elston, Clybourne, Southwest Highway, South Chicago, cutting through the grid. And they frequently are streets that encourage speeding because they're quite wide. So anyways, those are some of the problems for Chinatown. Now we're going to move on and take a look at the 40th Ward. What you see here in this little slide is an area just north of the intersection of Lawrence Avenue and Western. There's big open space there that was ugly. Turns out it's actually city land, and it's been a project of the alderman of the 40th Ward, Andre Vasquez, to make this a more pedestrian-friendly space. And so on the next slide, Julia, you see what's being done. And you can already see that with a little bit of paint, already that area is feeling more inviting. And it's a work in progress, and hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit more about what's going on in that area. But I think I've hit all the main things that I wanted to talk about. And I want to introduce Linda, who's going to introduce the community members who will first make a presentation about their communities. First Darek, and then Renee, and then Linda will introduce the alderman, who will talk a little bit more about his perspective, and then we'll engage in some give and take. But thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Robert mentioned, we're going to be speaking to community members in Chinatown and Edgewater. And the original format had Representative Ma joining us today. So we've had to pivot a little bit. And so I think we're going to see how the conversation flows and what themes come out of both communities and how we can have a collective conversation. So to start off with, we'd like to have Darek from Chinatown talk to us a little bit more about the issues in their community and what are the big issues related to biking and walking.
Hi, hello, my name is Darek. I live in a weird cross point of Farmer Square, Bridgeport, in Chinatown. And I work at Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, CBCAC for short, to help civically engage my community members to harness their voices and their power for positive community development. To me, when I think of Chinatown, I think a lot of people think the same things. I think of the food and architecture that represent um, our culture and our history as Chinese Americans that have immigrated here. We are a largely immigrant Chinese American community, and we have a significant population of elderly folks, which is really important to me when I think about transportation, when I think about my grandparents who are in Chinatown and how they um, navigate the outside world. Um, Now, consider Chinatown as operating on a tourist economy where a lot of revenue comes in from visitors um, patronizing our restaurants, our gift stores, etc. And I think that's reflected in our streets where you have bigger, better maintained streets where um, our storefronts are, while residential streets are often narrower and not as well maintained. Some streets can barely fit 2 cars. But I didn't always think about biking and walking with Chinatown. I didn't always think about biking and walking in general. When I was a high school student, transportation was either my parents driving me to school or me taking the train or bus. When I got involved with CBCAC, that's when I began to walk more, and that's when I began to be in what I consider like core Chinatown more. I eventually picked up on how important walking and biking infrastructure is as I'm walking and observing my surroundings and the people in this community. Um, and I'm also noticing how important this infrastructure is to people who are less able-bodied than me. Again, like keeping in mind of our significant elderly population. I was also involved with that Chinatown walkability report back in 2017. I was someone who helped with assessing our streets for walkability and bikeability, and we had found issues like narrow and broken sidewalks, insufficient walking time on streets where they had traffic lights, and a lack of bike lanes and protections for bikers. When I think about pedestrian and biker safety, the big, like #1 issue for me is the Archer, Princeton, and Cermak 6-way intersection, where even for me as a young able-bodied person, I get uncomfortable walking across those streets, sometimes unsafe as um, cars are like rapidly turning from multiple different directions. And there's only one bike lane that's along Archer, and there's no physical barriers and there's no other bike lanes in Chinatown. I know we have 2 DV stations, one at our old public library site and another one at our Pingtong Park. But I don't really see our community members taking advantage of these biking stations. I usually only see, tourists and visitors taking advantage of these assets. When I think of community members biking, I only think of groups of young boys who are on their bikes, just hanging out with each other. Sometimes they're a bit annoying as they have their boombox really loud, playing while they're riding in the streets. And I'd like to see more adults and elderly folks who can bike be able to enjoy that activity either like recreationally or use biking as a way to transport themselves around. I'd like to see that. more often.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful view on Chinatown and different issues that Darek sees in their community, such as the elderly population and how some certain intersections aren't necessarily safe for people crossing, whether you're young or older. Thinking about how the infrastructure may not always serve any of the needs that people have, regardless of age and ability. So I think that's a really important point to note. So next up, we'll have Renee from Edgewater talk to us more about their work and the issues that they see in their community.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So at the Edgewater Environmental Sustainability Project, we are a coalition of community members and environmental stewards. Our mission is to bring a green voice to local challenges. We empower people to build and maintain a more sustainable future through action, organizing, education, and advocacy. And we are rooted in advancing a healthy and verdant Edgewater. And we've been doing this work in Edgewater for over 10 years. So we're involved in several citywide campaigns and local efforts on transportation. Just to share, Darek gave such a nice overview of his experience with transportation in his neighborhood, so I wanted to share a little bit from my experience moving around in our area as well. My commute actually goes right by the plaza in Andre's Soda there, going from the lakefront by where I live to the Chicago River where my office is. And from that route, there are no safe or quality bike routes. And I think this plaza just shows the possibilities for transportation improvements, along with another 40th Ward project on Catalpa Street in Andersonville as well. Personally, I walk, I bike, I take divvy, I take transit, and I also drive a car. I used to mostly bike prior to COVID, and now I mostly walk. So I think I'm likely reflective of a lot of people in Edgewater, where we use a variety of modes, and those modes have shifted since COVID. So I want to share a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing as an organization. Since COVID, our community conversations have expressed a lot of concern about the lack of green space and efforts to give people more space to bike, run, walk, enjoy nature, including those that are unable to keep moving. As many of us in the sustainable transportation advocacy world already know, and what became more obvious to us this spring and summer was that there is not enough space for people and too much space for cars. So our community came together to say that we need more open spaces, including those open space to move within and accessible transportation options. So through these community conversations, we provided many guidelines and resources and offered our organization's help to a variety of officials and departments. I'm just going to highlight some of the things that we called for that are relevant to the conversation we're having tonight. One is that we're asking the city to not shut down the Lakefront Bike Trail, the 606, or other future off-street trails for essential workers. We're asking that they make a plan for the implementation for an emergency citywide open streets program and reinstate the Department of the Environment, which, while we realize is unlikely in the 2021 budget, it still needs to be said. So one experience that we had in Edgewater is that many people in our community wanted an open street on Glenwood. It's already a safe bike route and nice bike route. But when it was announced, our Alder's office received hundreds of emails concerned about parking and declined to move forward with the project. So this is one example of there was a possibility due to COVID and it didn't go forward in the way that a lot of people in our community would have wanted. So we have asked and just hope that in the future the community is engaged in advance of such announcements, and there is a plan for these projects that is transparent and addresses people's concerns in advance, and organizations like mine or Darek can work with our elected reps to make sure that the community is informed and we're getting good community feedback on projects. Also just wanted to mention a couple other things that we do. So we're involved in the task force for the North Lakeshore Drive, Redefine the Drive and Northern Terminus Study Area. We are submitting feedback. We're concerned about the project's prioritization over personal vehicles over pedestrians, bikes, and transits. And we'll continue to advocate for a change in the fundamental approach of that project from a pollution center model to a one of sustainability and climate resiliency. We also are doing some work with the CTA Red Line, the Metra station that's coming to Edgewater, the Peterson Ridge Metro station, and we're active with the Ready for Chicago 100, Ready for 100 Chicago campaign, which if you're familiar with, I'm going to put a link in the chat for people to check out. So that's a little bit about us and kind of what we do in the community. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Renee. I think you brought up some really important points, thinking about multimodalism and how very few people are just choosing one mode to get around. Some people might be biking, they might be walking, they might be taking transit, they may be driving. And I think it's important to think about how to create streets and neighborhoods where people can interact with space in different ways as possible. I think the conversation around lack of green space is obviously became a lot more important this year, and it was important before, but this year has really highlighted how green space is really essential to our livability and strong communities. And I think as we experience a surge in COVID, I think that even if we're going into winter, I think that conversation also becomes even more important. Just thinking about the IDPH and their recent announcement of something short, it seems like short of a stay-at-home order, but looks like we're moving that way again. And I think the open streets conversation obviously was very prominent in the spring, and Active Trends, we did a lot of work around asking people questions about that and what they would like to see in their communities. And that came up as a prominent point in some Northside communities, while in other Southwest Side communities that we spoke to, it didn't come up as a big concern in their communities. So also thinking about how we can be prioritizing issues based on local needs. So maybe one community thinks that this is an important part of their COVID response, and other communities might have other needs. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation as well. Being context specific is very important. So I think our next panelist we'll have is Alderman Vasquez to give us a little bit more information about the ward and different issues that residents experience in the 40th ward.
Sure. Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you so much, Active Trans and all the other groups, for really organizing this kind of conversation. I think it's super important. You know, I think for me, I'm just coming out of budget hearings. So the first thing that's on my mind, it really is all the different needs that the city has. And I think that it's important that the voices that are speaking out about transportation justice do so. And so I really appreciate, one, the work you do, but also how you do it, because it really does ground it on a justice platform. And, you know, in the 40th ward, we are doing a little bit better than some of the other wards in a lot of aspects. But I think when you think about people's ability to be mobile in forms other than vehicles, we have a lot to work on. I think we often look at privilege through a lot of different lenses. We don't often enough talk about what a privilege it is to be able to have a vehicle to go from one place to another, and not have to be reliant on public transportation or other means. And that's a mistake to only think of it of those who have privilege and what that experience is like without taking in what it means for everybody else. Like, I grew up, born and raised in this city, gentrified through different towns or through different neighborhoods, but always broke. So always having to figure out ways to commute from one way to the other, using public transportation or walking. I'll admit, and this is something that I've said before, because we were so sheltered, I never learned how to ride a bike, and I learned how to drive at 25. So I had to really figure out ways to go from one place to another. And so I'm very appreciative of the fight here. So what I am really happy about is that COVID, although it's done a lot of horrible things to a lot of people, it also has provided opportunities for people to reimagine everything. And included in that is the public way. So for me, what I was particularly excited about was when the shared streets, initiative was presented, different ways to find how to open up streets. I agree, because I'd seen that New York and other cities had done it, really creating a whole system of open streets to allow folks to commute from one way to the other. But I don't know that the administration was open to moving in that direction. But because they were doing blocks here and there, I knew that I could find different ways to do it in the 40th Ward, one of which is the Ainsley Arts Plaza, where we're going to be vacating this stretch of Lincoln behind me so that no more vehicles will ever travel through here, and space for folks to be able to enjoy the public space, to understand what it's like to have that open space. We're also working on developments for Lincoln Avenue all the way to Catalpa, as well as Western and Lawrence. All of those with a focus on two different things. One, economic development and supporting the local businesses that are there. But as is very tied to that, it's about the ability to have more pedestrianization, to have more of the ability for people to enjoy being out and being able to walk in a space. So that's something kind of at the local level. I think we're looking at the way we did Catalpa as a shared street as well for the Black Trans Lives Matter mural. We're also looking at Catalpa West, is what we call it, between Western and Lincoln, for another type of space to be able to kind of really get folks to reimagine that. At the city level, there are constraints when looking at the budget, but there's also, a lot of impetus upon making the environment and transportation a priority. And I know that the mayor has spoken about a potential capital plan, which would be multi-billion dollars over a number of years to invest in infrastructure, which encompasses really all of what we're talking about. So I'm thankful to be able to be in a position where, even just being in this office for not even a year and a half yet, to be able to try new things, to push the envelope, to set precedent, because people do get excited when you create this stuff, right? When you do things like this, I think the city embraces it, because it knows that it's time for the city to catch up to 2020 and to move beyond where we currently are. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to do that. I'm also very thankful to be here, because I know that although many people view elected officials as experts, we're not. And when we do our job best, we're listening to the folks that are the experts and doing the work and in the experience. So what I hope to take from this conversation is not just, providing information on what we're working on, but also learning from you all what things we should be working on and how to get those things accomplished. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great. I think for starters, Alderman Vasquez, we received a lot of different questions via our online forum prior to the conversation. And I think I tried to consolidate based on themes, and there was a lot of different topics. Some I think that you could answer, some maybe a little out of your purview, but I think a big theme that I saw was a lot of people had concerns around abuse of bike lanes, in terms of like people not respecting them, people parking in bike lanes, cleaning bike lanes, like for example, like dirt or like leaves, and also the question of expanding bike lanes, especially giving people more options to be able to bike. So I'm wondering your thoughts around like next steps or overarching thoughts around those themes.
Yeah, I think a lot of infrastructure needs to be built, and I don't mean that necessarily as far as construction. I mean it more as far as like, if you value something, you build infrastructure around it. Meaning, like the 311 app should be something that I think more speaks to what that experience is. Right now in the 311 app, you can mark if you see debris on the street. You can also send a request if someone's blocking a bike lane. But I think we know that 311 is not always the most responsive for situations like that. So I think part of creating infrastructure is making sure that you have the support systems in place. And I think when I look at something like bike lane uprising, I think that clearly is more fulsome in being able to articulate all the different things that need to be worked on. So I think that's one. I think in looking at bike lanes themselves, we've got to make sure that in every possible scenario where we can, that we're looking at protected bike lanes, right? Where it's vehicle, parking, bike lane, curb. Because I think that provides really the kind of safety one would want if you're biking through the city. That's something we do in 40. So whenever the opportunity presents itself for streetscaping or anything like that, like my first default question is, can we do those protected lanes? Is that possible? It's sometimes a challenge on the size of the streets, but I think part of it is having us as city council members making that kind of like the default. Hey, this would be the first thing we do. If we can't do that, let's look at other options. But we want to make sure we create that kind of environment as well.
And I wanted to open it up to Renee or Darek. I'm not sure if you have specific questions or conversation points that you wanted to touch on before I can, or before I ask another question that someone submitted.
Yeah, so sorry, I just saw a quick one on the chat.
Yeah, that one was submitted too.
Yeah, that was the one that's outside of my purview. So I don't necessarily know kind of with that one, or the other trail, the UP, the north one that's from Lincolnwood to Foster. I think both of those fall outside of 40. So I don't have like the latest updates on that, but it's something that I can take back and talk to my colleagues about and be able to have a response back for you.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything recently about El Paseo. I think the most recent iteration or news that I heard was that they were expanding the garden. So people that run the Paseo Community Garden were going to expand it. But as far as plans in place, it's always been a little ambiguous in terms of what the process is behind the scenes. It wasn't as clear cut, it seems, as the 606 that I think seemed to have clarity on timeline. So I think, yeah, I don't know if a lot of people know the exact timeline for El Paseo necessarily.
Yeah, and to that point, I do know for like typically when you have a point person on the project, right? Like the 606 is something that there's clear vision to execute from beginning to end. So I don't know if like the change of elections and who are in the seats now, if that further complicates the ability for like something to move forward. But it's something, like I said, I can find out.
Yeah, and I think obviously the difficulty of having, it's too like Little Village and Pilsen, and I think there's been some people that are for the plan and other people that have more concerns around gentrification, affordability, and also prioritization, whether it's what the community needs. So I think that's also adds on to I think a little bit more trickiness of that project. But we'll be sure to update everyone if we hear any updates around that. So I'll just go ahead and bring up another question that we received. I think you already started to talk about this, Alderman, around the open streets, shared streets. Some people submitted what is the potential to have like a whole network or permanent street closings to cars around the city, and also how we can use that as also continuing to respond to COVID and the need to create spaces outside. So I think you already started to kind of address that. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think the challenge, and I appreciate, because Renee mentioned some of it during when she her time speaking, it's that there's so much opposition. So I think when people think about open streets, I understand exactly why it's something we need to do, but literally anytime a parking spot is in jeopardy, you watch neighbors just swarm. And I think what we need to get to a position of is having the organization on the ground of the neighbors who don't feel that way, who are equally as loud and equally as organized. Because, you know, for example, the way we do any development and shared streets is a little bit separate. We have an open community input. And if what I'm hearing is a majority of neighbors who are in opposition, it's going to weigh on what my decision is because I'm a representative member of a body. So I think a lot of it is about making sure you have people really advocating for it and talking to neighbors to get an understanding of it. You know, for me, I think the shared street, and I know the Commissioner Biaggi, the Commissioner of Department of Transportation, feels the same way, sees the opportunity and kind of wants to move in that direction. But you need the public support to be able to do it, because typically, you know, unless the mayor's got a strong passion for something, she's not going to necessarily move in that direction to deliver it in a fulsome manner. But I think people saw that the shared streets was a success, and I do know that it's going to be recurring, or at least that's what the conversations have been. I think it needs to be evergreen because we need to figure that out even more so during the winter when like snow is going to make it harder to walk on the sidewalks, and you're going to need that kind of clean streets for everything. So the other challenge, which is a separate one, I wanted to close Clark. So in Andersonville, I thought you could go from Foster to maybe Catalpa and try to do that, but we received a lot of pushback from the actual businesses. So although the restaurants were all for it, the businesses who were not restaurants had concerns about loss of business because people wouldn't necessarily go at the same level. Now, I think, and I've articulated this to the Andersonville Chamber, that you really miss an opportunity, that if you create the open street, you actually are able to draw more people and have your wares out on the street to be able to sell. So as a business, it should be helpful. We need to figure out ways to make that something that retail businesses can do because there's laws against it currently. But all that to say, these things are a work in progress. And if you would have told me a year or two ago that we'd be able to block off streets and create that kind of even one block or a couple, I would have imagined it would have been a much harder challenge. And thankfully, we're able to kind of go in this direction and utilize that to build upon the momentum.
Great, thank you so much. That was very helpful. We received the other questions in the chat and in the Q&A box. Also, I think you started to touch upon this as well. A broader question, someone asked, on a base level, how do we get the city to reprioritize users of public space? How can we get the city to rethink its priorities to keep pedestrians, bikers, and transit users safe? And more specifically, as an alderman, is there a ratio for bike infrastructure investments?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think that I might have to go back to the question because it seemed like a three-parter, right?
Yeah,
so,
there was.
Yeah. So I think the first part, as far as like, how can we more facilitate like a lot of the open streets and like that direction? The one thing that's really been successful for us has been art. Like the fact that we were able to create this mural made it so people could wrap their head around it being a space. On Catalpa, we had the Black Trans Lives Matter mural, where it wasn't originally going to be a shared street at all. We had just gotten permission to do the mural, but I knew that I could say, hey, we want to make sure we keep this mural for as long as we can. So can we make it a shared street to make sure we don't have as much traffic over it? That allowed us to move in that direction, right? So I think the thing that's interesting and funny to me is like, regardless of like economic status, where people are from or anything, art is something that's universal, that people go, oh, I'd love to see that. And I think once you can create that, you can kind of move forward from there. There was what was the second part? Because I know the third one was about the ratio.
Yeah, there was a question about, is there a ratio for bike infrastructure investments as an alderman? And somebody asked, how, kind of related, how realistic is it to get CDOT to return to the goal of fully protected bike lanes for the COVID budget? I don't know if COVID budget isn't interesting.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the COVID budget's really a problem, right? Like, we're talking a $1.5 billion hole. What's being proposed is a $94 million tax, a debt restructuring of over $500 million, 300 potential layoffs, and furlough for 5 days for all non-union workers. That is a terrible budget to have to work with, and I'd argue probably the worst budget in the city's history, right? So just to really kind of set that in. That makes it challenging. But I do think that the mayor, like really having the intent of setting up the first capital plan for the city, because the city's never had one, and looking at it, looking at investment from a multi-year standpoint. Like, how do we make sure our bridges, our viaducts, our streets are invested in, as well as other components, economic development, and being able to put money towards that. That is something that has never occurred in the city. And I think it's a good opportunity to make sure that the priorities for it, bike protection lanes are at the forefront, as well as other multimodal forms of transportation. As far as in Alder, we have a little bit of menu budget. So typically it's like 1.3 million per year, which may sound like a lot to some folks, but it's not. So for example, if you want to do a block of green alley, for example, right? $250,000, which means you could maybe do 5 in a ward and not be able to do anything else. So trying to make that stretch is also a challenge. The thing that I've seen where the opportunities present themselves are like Lawrence for that streetscape, which was already planned, and there's TIF funds that are attributed to it. We're talking about having a bike lane there to make sure we open that up more. Looking at Lincoln, when we get to the point where we're doing that street redevelopment, I think that's a conversation to make sure we're finding ways to put a lane. And there's a larger one from Western, all the way from Evanston to, I believe, Addison, that the Department of Planning and Design is actually looking at redeveloping, where I think there's absolute opportunity there. So it's not necessarily about do I as a city council member have the funds to be able to apply to it, more than do I have the vision that when an opportunity presents itself, that we're saying, hey, this needs to be a component of it. If we think about it that way and find a way to make it a priority in the capital plan, I think we can make a lot of inroads as far as that, no pun intended.
Great, thank you. I know you're getting all the easy questions.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to turn it on over to Darek. I think he had a question for you.
Sure.
Hi, Alderman Vasquez.
Hey.
With regards to pedestrian and biker safety, I've only seen minor improvements done in Chinatown, such as trimming trees that are blocking signage, repainting crosswalks, and fixing sidewalks where restaurants or stores are. To me, I think there's little to no drastic improvement, even with our infamous 6-way intersection. Thinking of the projects you've worked on, can you describe the process for you as an alderman for making safety improvements for pedestrians and bikers?
Yeah, I think for me, my core value is open government. And what I mean by that is a lot of the things that we do are really driven by what neighbors bring to us. So in your scenario, Darek, let's say similarly, if somebody in the ward had those recommendations for, let's say foster, which I'm sure people do, they would reach out to our office, and then we could escalate those things to be able to address them more specifically. I think the problem that maybe isn't appreciated is, as somebody in this position, the complaints are 24/7 from every direction about everything, right? In order for something to really get a little bit of traction, I tend to be more accessible than most, meaning most of the people that know me know that you can reach me through Facebook, Twitter, email. I give people my cell phone number. That allows me the ability to go to oh, okay, I heard this is going on in the street. Let me call, streets and sanitation to go deal with that. I'm a little bit of a rare bird in that aspect, because I've always been stuck to my devices like that. But I think for what you're speaking specifically, if there are things that you have as recommendations and ideas, feel free to send those my way as well, because I can go talk to Alderman Sixto Lopez, to see what work is being done and what work can be done.
I think that's an important point that Andre makes, because he is so responsive. Like, I have sent him a message on Slack before and he's responded. And it's important to realize that that's not the case for all wards in the city. And some of us are lucky, and other people have other priorities or other communication styles. And like, how do we come together as communities across the city with active trans help, with other people that actually have the resources? Like, my organization is all volunteer, so we have a lot of ideas and a lot of urge, but we need the support of people in power to make some of these things a reality. And for the example of like the open streets, like while in Edgewater, we had the bikeway plan that had Glenwood on it. And as Linda mentioned, like, that was not a priority for other places in the city. So it needs to be like community focused, but then like as a local organization, we also realize that there might be other priorities in other parts of the neighborhood that are more important than the Glenwood open street. And we would also support Chinatown doing a new bikeway that might be more important than Glenwood being an open street. So there's give and takes, and like, we have to have that conversation
Yeah,
as an advocacy community and as our local communities.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it's also like, I don't know necessarily that it's like the alders have different priorities more than there's limited capacity, right? Like, you know, I think you've seen from our Slack group, I try to bring in as many neighbors as we can because of my nature as an organizer, is to say, oh, if you're invested in this, then cool, let's organize like a plan together, let's present that, and then we can move, because independently on my own, I wouldn't be able to get that far doing it, right? Like, we had a volunteer, well, we've been developing like a volunteer legislative team, things like that. I do think we have an area of opportunity because we don't have as robust like an environment component. I think, Renee, you are the environmental component in the 40th ward, but you know, it's trying to build upon that, because it allows folks to really flesh out and have an understanding about how things get done and be able to help us move things forward. And so, yeah, you know, different alders have different ways of doing things. I firmly believe, because I think I'm a unicorn even getting to this position, that it's incumbent upon me to share it with the people and be able to share that power, because prior to being here, growing up in the city, I had zero idea how government worked or what an alderman does or any of those things. And it's my job to make sure that other folks don't go through that and know how to use their government.
We received another question. Alderman, could you advocate for the city to actually track bike lane uprising and even issue citations via the photos and data that is posted there? 311 has said straight out they cannot respond to complaints. And I'd also like to add that I think how this fits into the conversation around enforcement and defunding the police. How do we, so this isn't part of the question, but I'd like to add how we can do enforcement without also being punitive, and also thinking about who is more likely to get over enforced, just historically with like police enforcement. So I'm wondering what you think the balance is there. What does I guess just enforcement look like on our streets?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to be, and this does require a lot of investment, right? It's a public awareness campaign of people really understanding and having respect for what that experience is, right? If someone's not biking and they drive, and I say this full admittance and guilt in saying it, right? When I was driving around, I'd always be like, oh, these cyclists are all coming in my space when I have a literal vehicle surrounding me. I think it's something that you have to be made aware as to what that's about, and that requires a lot. I think as far as enforcement in general, I would view it as kind of the way we do ticketing, right? Where, you know, if you do the red light, you might get a pass the first time, or you get the letter saying, hey, you were going to get a ticket, but you didn't this time. And then ultimately getting to the point where people are cited and have to pay. That also has its equity components that we have to make sure we get right. And I know something that we've talked about in city council, I've introduced to our office, is a graduated fines and fee structure that's based on people's self-reported income, right? So you're making more, you're paying more. And if you're making less, you're paying less. You know, the challenge, and this kind of dovetails with the 311 part, is that as you might imagine, the government's not the best at doing technology. It is crazy over there. It is boxes of papers from the 1980s that you gotta blow dust off just to get stuff done. The 311 is functioning off of a software called Salesforce, and I used to work for AT&T for 12 years, so I'm familiar with Salesforce. We don't do as much as we could do with that system. I've repeatedly reached out to the Department of Asset and Information Systems and said, hey, let me be the guinea pig. Give us more access to this system, because there is tons more you can do as far as being able to track things. Now, if we were able to figure that out, I think finding ways to integrate that with bike lane uprising, or at least getting some components of it on the 311 system, would work. Sometimes I'm tempted to just go to visit the Shy Hack Night people and just say, hey, this is really cool here. This is really cool there. How about you all put together the app that combines it so we can try to get that done? But it's not fair, because the government should be able to do that, right? You all pay taxes because you want to see investment go in certain directions. So what I can say is my commitment is concrete, solid, as it pertains to try to really modernize the city and use better technology and use it properly. Because if we do that, we're so much better off for it. Like, looking at the website, looking at Bike Lane Uprising, it's gorgeous. It's open. You can put your tickets on different things. You see the map. That was done through people who were just passionate about it. They didn't have the means that a government does. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and that's something that I'm interested in moving forward on, because we just would serve constituents better.
Yeah, I think about the enforcement aspect that you were talking about earlier, and how to make that equitable and just, and something that would help walkability is the cameras. Like, I feel safer biking and walking around at unsafe intersections when I know there's cameras there, but there's so many issues with that. So I really like that idea about having equitable structure on that. I was jumping in with a question with Linda's suggestion too, so just kind of moving in a different direction. Do you know if there's anything being done by the city to plan or prepare for, we're already in this COVID resurgence, right? And we saw access to ways to move around get shut down. Is the city doing anything, or specific departments to prepare to not shut down the CTA and the trails and the parks?
I tend to have these kind of smiles when I get tense and anxious about things. Like, I started I wish I could say that we did. What's been my experience since taking office is that more times than I'm comfortable conveying, I find out things through the news, meaning the decision gets made either late in the game, or we're being kept out up until the point the announcements are made. And that is not a good way to serve the public. I think if you get us, the city council members that are charged with representing 55,000 people in our ward, the ability to have the information to communicate things, we'd be much better off. But no, we don't get the plans until the last minute when they occur. So I couldn't in good faith say there is a plan, there might be a plan. Hell, we'll find out when the Sun Times lets us know what the plan is, but we'll keep asking. So
then, to roll off that question, just based on what you know in your role, what do you think organizations like mine or Darek's can do to hold the city accountable when it comes to ensuring accessibility and movement in our neighborhoods for bikers and walkers?
Definitely. I would say there's two things, right? One, which is just challenging, right? And it's being in the streets and protesting and making yourself heard about it. That's challenging because of COVID. It just is across the board for anything that we're talking about, right? But the other piece, which I think is something we pride ourselves on in the 40th Ward office, is having that legislative volunteer component of you know what? I'm not going to have the greatest ideas on everything, but the folks that are doing the work are. And if they present that to us and together we can flesh out what's legal, what we can propose, and how we can work it, yeah, then I can reach out to the colleagues, get us to 26 votes, or do our damnedest to try to make sure we can pass things and make those changes. So I would say, and I, like I say, Renee, you know, because you know how accessible I am. It is very much just like coming up to me and saying, hey, here's an idea I think works really well. I'll say, great. Let me introduce you to Jeffrey Cubbage, our director of policy. Or, you know, every couple of weeks we meet up. Feel free to bring that idea in so we could flesh out. It is wild that I'm in the position to be able to say that's a great way to do it. But yeah, it is a great way to do it. Feel free to bring it our way. I want to make sure we're doing more for that as well as for the environment.
Thank you.
Derek, did you want to ask any question? Wanted to give you a chance if you do. No pressure though.
Sure. I had a question that I wrote more towards Rep Moss. I'm not sure how applicable it is to you, but good luck answering.
Thanks.
Thinking of my grandparents, neighbors, and community members, we certainly have our complaints about our transportation options, but very rarely do we talk about how to improve transportation, and even more rare is talking to our elected officials about these issues, either because there's a language barrier, there's discomfort with contacting an elected official, there's a historical feeling of disengagement or distrust with electeds, etc. So how can people, especially our elderly and the young people who want to support them, get involved in working with elected officials to create a better environment for walking and biking?
Yeah, totally. And I like how you warmed it up and then it was like, oh no, I can answer that one. So I appreciate that, you know, because because like I'm first generation, right? So my parents were immigrants who similarly were like, they're people who, even when they're sick, they're not going to the doctor because they're concerned about language access there, right? It's even harder and more intimidating to engage in government. So I absolutely feel that. I think part of your answer is in the question. Like, what can young folks and old folks do? Here's what the young folks can do: help the old folks. Meaning, right, if the older folks are having the language barrier because it's generational, or they're having mobility issues, then the young folks need to say, hey, let's make sure we can communicate. You know, because like I in my experience being first generation, I speak Spanish and English, right? It's incumbent upon me to be like, hey, I'm gonna go ask folks what they need, and then be the one to have to do some of the lifting on that. And I think that requires a lot, right? The second part, your premise, which is part of the second part, makes perfect sense. One, I'm in government, I don't trust government. So if you're outside of government, you don't trust government, you are okay. I think that's part of the reason, unfortunately, why the fair tax didn't pass, for example. But guess what? There's track history why people feel that way, right? The city also doesn't do a good job through public education to really teach people about their civic, really their civic power, right? For like, I remember going to school, you would get one constitution test, they'd pat you on the back and say, great, you figured it out, you understand government, you got your 3 branches, keep it moving. At no point did I have a clue how the municipal government worked, right? I didn't start learning this stuff till 5 years ago. 5 years ago that I just went, you know what, I'm gonna go Google it. And that is what got me to the point where I understood it better. Now, again, because that is my experience, now that I'm here, I think it's my job to make sure I make it easier for everyone else to learn how to use it, right? So I think I would do a couple of things. You go on the city website or go to shycityclerk.com, and that's Clerk Ana Valencia's website. They live stream all the committee hearings, all the city council meetings. it's not like the most fun in the world. It's my job, so I'm there all the time. But I think if you watch a couple of those, you'll be able to see which alders are like, oh, I think I could reach out to that one about an issue because clearly they're engaged about this, right? So I say that now because in the world where we're in, where everybody's watching Zoom 24/7 and that's how you communicate, you can pop in on some of those and they're all recorded and archived that you'll be able to find which alders are the ones that are going to help. I'll tell you, a lot of the rookies that got elected this last run are of the same mindset. Like Matt Martin in 47, Maria Haddon in 49, Byron in the 25th, Jeanette Taylor in the 20th, Rosana Rodriguez in the 33rd. These are all folks that came from the communities that we're all talking about that similarly feel that they have to open up the access. So yeah, I mean, I could plug in. Feel free to reach out to us. I'm more than happy to like point you in a direction because that would put you at way more of a head start than I started because I know you're not 35 years old. So go team.
Thank you so much. So we're at our last 20 minutes. So for this next portion, so I'll ask one more question. And if anyone else has questions, you could add them in the chat and then we can add you as a panelist so you can ask the question yourself. So let us know if you'd like to ask a question, put it in the chat or in the Q&A and we can add you. So for the last question, I think this is coming from me, just basing it off what I've been hearing.
Sure.
And just try to capping it off. It seems like there's been a lot of questions around like priorities of the city and how to prioritize people walking, people biking, and also the kind of the COVID framing was kind of at the forefront of the conversation. And we've seen a lot of different strategies that have been used this year, a lot of experimentation, and I would say some strategies that aren't necessarily leading to the sustainability of like walking and biking in public transit, namely the transit shutdowns we've been seeing and some of the usage of city vehicles to block streets, which have also been blocking bike lanes. So I'm just wondering how we can take some of these strategies during like kind of a time of a lot of uncertainty and sometimes feels like chaos. How do we make sure those strategies are also leading to the sustainability of our communities rather than undermining those efforts? So yeah, so I'm just wondering your thoughts about that.
Yeah, totally. I appreciate the question. When I was a kid, I taught myself chess and then I forgot it, right? But you learn a lot through chess. And what I mean by that is you don't necessarily go for the thing you want directly. You can set it up to be able to achieve the goal. So let's say, for example, your point about city vehicles being propped up everywhere because, hey, downtown could get attacked, so let's protect downtown, right? Like, or whatever. You could go about it a couple ways. You could say, hey, you know what? This is blocking bikes. This is why this needs to change. It's not equitable. I'm willing to bet any penny I have in my pocket that would not get you that far, when the other side of the coin is, hey, we have to keep people safe, right? However, the other route you could go is say, you know, it costs a lot of money to be able to have these vehicles out there when they should be out doing what they need to be doing. And you're paying also for the extra overtime for people to be out there watching these vehicles that you have out there. So if we're dealing with a budget where we don't have the funds to start off with, how much are we spending on having these vehicles out there? Because we need to save every penny we can get. You can get a lot further with that conversation because people are looking at it from that lens more than like bike safety. So that's what I mean as far as like the chess move, where it's like, I always think about things whenever we have a problem. I go, well, what's the goal? That is the primary function. That's what we have to reach. Now, what are the different ways we can get to it, right? I knew this is crazy. Like, yes, I'm a dork, and that's why this is my background. But I'm gonna show you how this happened. So before I got elected, I just kept looking at it and going, this is not, it doesn't make sense. If you think about Lincoln Square, it stops at Lawrence and no one ever crosses to go further north because they view it as not being as swanky as the other part of Lincoln Square, right? And I looked at this specific triangle and said, this needs to be something that pulls people across from Lawrence so they can continue the move. I had that in my head the whole time before even getting into office. I was like, that needs to be something. Then one day, 8 months ago, across my desk, McDonald's was asking for permission to redevelop McDonald's. And I said, cool, we're not going to have this conversation about what they're going to be permitted to do until we have a conversation about what we do with the public space in front of it. So we're going to let them know what we're going to do with this public space. Guess what, McDonald's? You're not going to be able to use it for parking anymore because you have plenty of parking space. You're going to have to figure out how you're redeveloping it, because this right here, this is city property, and we want to make sure we're doing this. And then what I told them was, by the way, it does benefit you if we have the space here. Welcome to the world of COVID, where you're not going to get as many people inside your restaurant to slang your Big Macs. So if we have a public space out here where people can gather, you also have the added benefit of having more clientele potentially. So you should probably want to get on the ball and get this going. That allowed me to then go reach out to everybody else and CDOT and go, is there any program we could do to make it a space? And there happened to be one where you can get an artist, paint, figure out the money. And so I reached out to the Department of Planning and the Department of Transportation. The first meeting we had, I said, hey, everybody, I want to get this done, so we need to do a weekly meeting. When are you all available every week? And they said, oh, let's figure it out. We could do Thursday, 9 a.m. So for 8 months, every Thursday morning, I've been meeting with both of the departments. I didn't find out until the hearing that occurred this past week. I'm the only city council member to meet that often with them. Everyone else is like, we're trying to get once a month. I was like, well, I've worked in AT&T. This is just how I roll. So let's get a schedule going and get it moving. It is why we're able to do it so quickly. So I think you've got to be ready for when the opportunities present themselves and then go. You have to be almost unapologetic and really believe in your vision for what you want to see. So the world that you all are envisioning when you talk about the environment, sustainability, transportation, that should be in your brain 24/7, which it is. And once the opportunity presents itself, then you move forward on that. And you'll be surprised what you accomplish. Because, yeah, I'm a little city kid who liked graffiti enough that I just did this. So, yeah, no, y'all can do it. Just send the ideas over and we'll find the opportunities.
That was a great analogy, the chess analogy. I think working in this space, it does seem to be a lot of negotiating of interests, and everyone. I think in general, people want a better community for people, and I think people have different visions for how that should go about, and different thoughts about who should be prioritized. And I think that happens in the transportation space, bikes, walking, cars, and all in public transit, thinking of how to balance all those priorities. It's always it's like a balancing act, and COVID has kind of thrown in another huge component into figuring out how prioritization takes place to be equitable. I think when you also put in the equity piece, racial justice piece, it also further, it makes it a lot more complex too, the prioritization chess game. So yeah, that was a really good analogy, thinking about what that looks like.
Well, and something you just said that's really important that I think people need to recognize is, what your self-interest is, but you also have to really do the homework on what somebody else's is. Like you're right. They're going to view things completely in a different perspective and at different priorities. Now, if you don't have an understanding of what those priorities are, you're in bad shape trying to figure out where to negotiate, right? And I see that a lot in the council, because we're for equity and justice, and that is what drives us. That is not the case with the other, all 50. And it's up to me to figure out what's the thing that moves them to be able to find that kind of common ground. So I think you're spot on about that.
Yeah, and I really liked your point earlier on art being a factor. I think oftentimes art gets underappreciated in terms of transportation, a transportation tool, and how that could also be part of reimagining our streets. But yeah, it was really interesting to hear how that became a factor to make some of these projects for carless streets more kind of palatable, which I think is a really interesting. I don't think most people would say, oh, I want people to accept my idea for a carless street. I'm gonna say I want to like a mural. So that's an interesting thing to think about too.
Everybody likes, like, you know, what they view as pretty, right? Like, oh, let's do it. Cool. Then here's what comes along with that. Yep. Oh, this is another side note. It is work. Let's say the Catalpa one in Edgewater or in Andersonville. Every weekend, somebody's moving it. Somebody's grabbing those barrels and taking them and moving them and trying to open the street back up. Then I have to come back the next morning just to put everything back. So that's what I mean. Like, there's people on both sides of the perspective that we need the folks that are about open streets to be out there, like, showing people that it's not just a fringe or anything. Like, this is the future. I know one of the questions was about the Office of the Environment, or as my colleague Daniel Espada calls it, the cubicle of the environment, because it's not been developed, right? We need the people to say, this is important, and how dare you not have that?
Yeah, and I think that was a really important point around the kind of open streets. There's still people behind that. I think some of the conversation often felt like you kind of lost the grasp of like the people power needed to make things happen, which, you know, people need to put cones out there. And when we're talking about that it's necessary to stay home as much as possible again, how does that play into this equation? We want to keep people safe.
Right.
So I think that was also something that Active Trans grappled with, making room for people on streets, but making sure that the essential workers, Black and brown people, which would be the people making those projects happen, would also be kept safe. And I think, you know, that's kind of a hard part of the conversation, because you want to keep reimagining possibilities, but this other component of, you know, life or death situations is also important. So I also wanted to give people a chance to, if there were any other questions, I could talk for a long time, I'm sure.
I was going to jump in with something, because I saw that some of the questions that were submitted in advance were specifically about maybe bringing more protected bike lanes to the 40th Ward, or talking about the plans to do east and westbound between the 40th through the 48th into the lake. So also curious, protected bike lanes or any updates on east-west bike lanes through the neighborhoods.
Yeah, so I think Lincoln is the one where I had asked to try to do it. Lincoln's kind of narrow, which is why it becomes challenging to actually do a protected lane there. We have definitely had conversations about the east-west travel. And like I said, I'm a guy who doesn't ride a bike, but I'm aware of like how that fundamentally changes and really offers access. So I think the streets we've looked at, there's really like 2 or 3 of them, right? So it's Catalpa, Berwyn, and Bryn Mawr are the ones that I think you could start creating that pathway to go east. Bryn Mawr's a little bit challenging because it goes through the cemetery, right? And then you're going through all this weird stuff to get to the other end. Not Catalpa, I'm sorry. I do think Berwyn is probably the one that would make sense. We have to get into more conversations. I have to talk to 48 as well to get that going. But I think it's something that clearly people are in support of. I think I don't think we would lose any parking. You never know. That's literally the hardest part. When it comes to affordable housing, when it comes to bikes, it is parking. It is people's just belief that they need multiple parking spots for every unit, that every time they lose a parking, it is the most valuable asset in a community. And that needs to really change, or we're going to watch the world burn, right? Like, we're not going to figure out where we need to go as far as the environment unless we get to that point.
Thank you for letting me squeeze that question in. And
Yeah.
As you know, like, we want to work with you and the 48th Ward on that. And we hope we will be able to make that happen and actively work to make that happen as well.
For sure.
Well, this has been a really interesting discussion here, and I'm glad to make some new friends with Darek and Renee, and I'm glad to see some old friends like Alderman Andre Vasquez. And I think Linda has really led a rich discussion here. I just wanted to make a couple observations, and maybe the best way to do that is quickly bring up the slide. Julia, people have been talking about doing things more globally, and at Active Trans, we've been advocating for a Safe Streets Fund. There's a slide about that. It's the next slide. And so we'd like to see a dedicated fund to address these issues across the city. We also want to support the city's Invest Southwest initiative. And we also want to make sure whatever is done with investments in the city of Chicago, it's done with an eye towards the broad racial equity goals. But I think the big takeaway here is that we need to continue to organize. I know a lot of people feel very empowered, and we can close out the slide there unless you just want to put up our contact slide. That's how you can reach us. But I'll go on a little rift here. I think we've all been empowered by some of the results that we've seen in the last election. You can kill the slide. Thank you, Julia. So, but I think the big takeaway is, you know, an election is just one activity. You know, just because we had a good day last week, or it could have been better, or it was worse 4 years ago, the real message, I think, is that whatever goal if your goal is, let's reduce the high crash corridors, let's have more bike lanes that are protected, let's make sure that every intersection has the infrastructure for the deaf and blind to use. We got to continue to organize those things, and we just can't do it in Edgewater. We got to connect Edgewater to Chinatown, Chinatown to Bronzeville, South Lawndale to Pilsen to Austin, and make this a citywide effort. So that's why we're here as Active Trans. We're trying to make those connections across the city to make it better for walking, biking, and public transportation. And thank you for being here. We will be doing some more of these types of activities because we're at a stay-at-home order, practically speaking, right now. And the only way to really express political power and organize right now is through activities like this. So we will be continuing to visit these issues as they impact Chicago globally and do deep dives into what's happening in particular parts of the city, but also trying to link what's going on, because the problems of the 40th Ward are the problems of the South Side, and the problems of the West Side are the problems of the Loop, because we have a auto-centric society that's killing us. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you all so much. Y'all take care.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good night.